G'day guys, I'm Martyn, MD at ACL, and this is my weekly vlog, and I'm coming to you today from Queensland. I'm on the road, and in true Queensland style, I'm sitting on the veranda, very Queensland, of an old Queenslander house, so I'm fully culturally appropriated. But this week I want to talk to you about what I wrote earlier in the week, which was A Manifesto For Men. And I did that partly because it was International Men's Day recently, but actually I did it because I thought it was important. And I think it's important because so much of our current political, cultural discourse touches on the issue of masculinity, femininity, male, female. It's becoming a bit of a hot button topic, to be honest. You can barely look at the political news these days without seeing some mention of women in politics or bullying of women. You can hardly get into the corporate world if you're a student or if you're a young person and not hear about gender quotas and things like that. Dr. Jordan Peterson, his Rise and Rise, is partly because he touches on this subject and tries to unpick some of the confusion around it. He's particularly popular with young men because he has a message for young men of particularly responsibility. This is hard to ignore, and of course that had to be so because we live in a culture that is all about, it's postmodern. And what does postmodernism do? Postmodernism divides groups against each other into tribes, and then it causes them to fight over power and privilege, and then it uses the culture war that flows out of that fight to deconstruct the whole thing. Now, we see that all over the place. You see the culture wars occurring between race groups, between sexual identity groups, between gender groups, male and female. And male and female was an easy target because human nature is already pre-calibrated for the job. If you go and look in Genesis 3, for example, I think there's a subtle nod in this direction. There's the curse there where God pronounces the curse on the man and the woman because of sin. And in the man's curse, it says that he shall rule over the woman. And in the woman's curse, it says that she shall desire to overrule the husband. It depends on the translation, and there's some dispute about whether that's what it means, but I really think that it must be, because throughout history you have seen both of those things played out in their worst possible sense, particularly the ruling over of women by men in a way that's brutal and in a way that's improper, and that conflict narrative, that subtle nod to an underlying conflict is there in the fall, and so human nature is ready primed to fall into this trap. And so postmodernism, I think, is drawing on something, a proclivity that's already there. And when I say it divides these groups against each other, I think the fruit of that is becoming quite bitter, particularly for the millennial generation. I'm not sure that the emerging underlying angst, the sense of the conflict narrative between the sexes was as strong in the past as it is now. I think that there is a fruit that's being born by this. And, we see it in a whole range of areas. The obvious ones are the ones that we see all the time in the news, and that is the violence against women issues, the sexualization of women. We see that all the time. And that is not getting better. And it's just amazing to me that as postmodernism has pitted the two genders against each other rather than draw them together through, say, marriage and things like that, it's amazing to me that they say, well, we've cast off marriage, we've said that fathers are irrelevant, we've sexualized children as young as possible, we've told men not to be responsible, and so on and so on. And then they realize that there is this conflict that's emerging. Well, my goodness, there is an intractable disaster that's taking place, and they turn around and point the finger at people like Christians who have traditional beliefs. Mate, we're not the bad guys. The people who have caused this, and the reason it's not getting better is because there's a much deeper and emerging and getting deeper cultural problem, which is centered, frankly, around the identitarian nature of postmodern politics. The other thing you see often is that, and I don't want to lose the fact that this is a two-way street. It can be a two-way street. Men do wrong and are responsible for wrong. But as Bindi Cole, who's the person who sued Andrew Bolt under 18C but has actually converted to Christ recently, she said that, look, she's realised since she became a Christian that her victimhood narrative was wrong, that she was responsible for everything that she had ever done and not others. And when it comes to doing wrong, it doesn't matter what identity group you fit into. It doesn't matter whether you're a victim or an oppressor, you can do wrong. And look, I don't buy into the victim oppressor thing anyway, it's wrong. But everybody does wrong and is individually responsible, and women can do wrong as well. And we don't talk about that much, but it does happen. You know, you read, for example, I mean, the Bible makes this distinction. You look at, for example, David. Now, David did wrong. David was blamed. David reaped bitter, bitter fruit for what he did. And so he should have. But, you know, you read Proverbs 6 and you see that there's situations actually comprehended where there is a man and a woman. It takes two to tango, right? And they both do wrong. The woman is seductive. The woman is manipulating. The woman uses her femininity for control purposes. And she is condemned individually. Not blamed for it, but condemned for what she did. The man is condemned for what he did. He was a fool. He was unwise. He went into that situation, and it says at the end their paths went down to death. And so we must understand that we do live in a time when both men and women are behaving badly towards each other. Now, it's true that there seems to be worse consequences physically when men behave badly to women, no doubt whatsoever. And I don't want to take away from that. But you know, there's the Me Too movement, and you look at that and you say, I get it. But then, of course, now you see, you know, Bloomberg did a survey of Wall Street executives, 30 of them, and said, well, what do you do in the wake of the Me Too movement, in the wake of all these accusations that have come out, particularly the Brett Kavanaugh stuff in the US? And, you know, these 30 executives, nearly all of them, said that they've adopted new rules. And they do things like the Mike Pence rule. You know, they don't have coffees with women. They don't have dinners with women. A lot of them said they avoid having close professional relationships. They avoid being in the office alone or even in small groups. And they avoid having direct reports. And so therefore the conflict narrative expands. Why? Because these guys said, well, one accusation from a woman and their career is finished. Now, people have to be individually responsible for their wrongs in all of this. And the point of saying all that is to show that this is an underlying cultural divide. Now, my concern is that this is becoming so much a part of the life of so many people, and it's so widely discussed, particularly in the younger generation. And, you know, I think the church has probably been a bit lethargic in addressing it, a little bit concerned about the controversies around declaring the truth about male and female, declaring the truth about what men are for, but especially what women are for, because again, there's that conflict narrative, that victim group that makes it much harder to talk about certain groups than others. I mean, it's easy for me to do this, let's be honest, because I'm talking about men. It's much easier, and I'm not going to do one about women yet, that's for sure. But on the male thing, there is a lot to be learned. And people are turning to culture increasingly for answers. And I said before that there's that conflict narrative, and what happens with that conflict narrative? Well, they use it to deconstruct the whole thing. And that is what's happening. You look, for example, at the advice to men that'll come out of the cultural, strongholds of our time. And the advice to men is consistently underlined by this word vulnerability. It says, be more vulnerable, be in touch with your emotional side, don't be afraid to share your feelings, and don't be alone and feel like you have to shoulder the burden of responsibility. Don't take that on yourself. Don't make yourself do that. Be weaker than that. Now, I paraphrase there at the end, but honestly, that's what it's saying. And so, you know, if a man gets in touch with his more feminine side, if a man is to talk about his emotions and, you know, whatever, then he is virtuous. Because he is a bastion of virtue as opposed to this great evil of masculinity, which is toxic. Toxic masculinity, you will have heard that saying. And that's part of the deconstruction process. But, you know, it's absolutely fascinating to me that that's what the advice is to men. But the advice to women is completely the opposite. I mean, the buzzword you'll hear for women is empowerment. And you'll hear, they'll be told all the time that they have to be, I heard the word formidable the other day, formidable women in politics, and that's what we need. And women need to be powerful, and they need to have tremendous confidence, and they need to get over their imposter syndrome, and they need to conquer the boardroom, they need to conquer politics. And, you know, if a woman makes it to CEO in the process and she's got great confidence, and she's kicking goals, well, you know what, she's a virtuous woman. Why? Well, frankly, she's also fighting toxic masculinity because she's putting the men in their place. Now, that's what culture will tell us. You know, I don't think Scripture is in accord with either of those views. If you look at, let's just pick two verses. 1 Corinthians 16:13. What does it say? It says, be watchful, Stand fast in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. And there's just one example of the Apostle Paul saying, there's such a thing as manliness. There's such a thing as acting like a man. And the things that go alongside that are strength, readiness, standing firm, immovability, fortitude. That's the kind of mood that he puts through in that verse with the concept of being a man. Masculinity. Act like men. And another verse that I could pick out is from Peter. Just forgotten the reference, but you can look it up. From Peter, where Peter's actually talking about femininity. And he's talking about what's wrong expression of that. He particularly talks about over-adornment and things like that. But he says, instead, clothe yourself with the meek and gentle, or meek and quiet spirit that is of great price in the sight of God. And I think that's a very beautiful thing. And the DNA of that statement, and the DNA of the statement that I made before about men, it just seems to be a different DNA to what the world is now telling us about male and female and how to solve the great problem of the conflict that frankly they've caused because of the deconstruction of institutions like marriage. It's different. Be that as it may, I think, frankly, that this narrative is trying to solve a reality. And the reality is, what do we do with masculine strength? What do we do with maleness and the fact that men do have the ability to be very strong, or stronger than women in many ways? What do we do about that? Do we deconstruct it and destroy it? Or how do we channel it? Is it even right? And I think people like Professor Jordan Peterson are gaining popularity because men feel the burden of this question in particular. And he has a narrative and he says, go out there and take responsibility. And that's not wrong. It's definitely not wrong. But my concern is that, young people have nowhere else to go except Jordan Peterson. And whilst a lot of what he says at the top level is pretty good, and whilst he's very good at deconstructing culture and postmodernism, my grave concern about him is that his deep, embedded, underlying philosophy is catastrophically wrong from a Christian perspective. He's a disciple of Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche, and I don't want to put him in a box because I don't think you can, and he would be the first to say that. But his drawings on the psychology and the teachings of those men is enormous. Both of those men formidably anti-Christian. Their ideas are frankly located in a very wrong place. And so, Peterson might look good on the surface, but the more you dig, the more you realize there's something missing in what he says. But I don't have any problem with what he says about being responsible. But I'm asking the question, well, what do we do with masculine strength as Christians? What is the biblical imperative? And I think that there's something that precedes responsibility. There's something that precedes nearly anything I can think of saying. And that is that channeling masculine strength, the right thing to do is to channel it into strength of character. And that's hard. That's really not easy. Because many young fellas, and I speak as a young guy myself, have been set back years by a heck of a lot of dissipation, of doing things of no value. The Netflix binges, the Xbox games, the LAN parties, if you're of that generation, the pornography, all of this stuff. The just going out and partying and trying to be cool. Stuff that is of no value whatsoever to the inner man. No value to character development. That is a waste of time. And so many young guys have been given over to years of that, and it set them back. But strength of character is so important. Because without that depth, without being that well of strength of character, you cannot be any of the things that you and I as a man want to be. cannot be an example to others if you are not exemplary. If you are not that person who is the benchmark, or who is at least on the way to the benchmark and shows those desires that are leading them there. You can't provide for others if you don't in yourself have the stamina, have the strength to continue, because that formed character is feeding endurance. You can't be someone who sacrifices yourself to protect others if you're not a giant of character. You can't be wise to navigate this life well, and then not only to navigate it yourself well, but to be a guide and a leader to others in this life. You can't love other people sacrificially. You cannot, and you know, this is one of the great disasters, one of the great tragedies of the postmodern way of thinking, is that it doesn't take into account the fact that people can and in fact must grow in character. And you know, that's the ultimate solution to whatever it might call privilege and power. There's all sorts of problems with those words, but let's go with it. The whole idea of being a giant in character is that you can take whatever your power and privilege might be, and you can lay it at the feet of others for them to serve them self-sacrificially, to love them. And you know, if you look in Ephesians, for example, how is a man instructed to love his wife? To lay down his very life for her, to take whatever he's got, whatever assets he has as a man, lay them down at her feet and use them for her in what the Bible calls agape, love. Now that's a solution that the postmodern world cannot comprehend, because you are an exponent of your tribal identity, but this character solution is there. And all of these things are things that men in their heart of hearts desire to be. And if they don't have the character, they will turn to other things. They'll try and be an example to others because they're the toughest and the coolest and whatever, and they have the most gangster clothes and they've got the biggest muscles, and they'll turn to other things. But there's nothing so priceless, and there's no call that comes to us more strongly and in a greater way than the call to character. And you know, this is the kind of lead that the world craves, frankly. The world needs these men. These men have existed throughout history, and they have been the people who God has used, regardless of their natural intellect, regardless of their natural ability. It's been the character. You know, throughout the Bible, so often, God changes the whole world, turns it upside down, because of one righteous man. You think about that. It's so true. He saw the character first. You look at the great men like Daniel, like Joseph. I tell you, we have celebrity heroes. We need to get rid of them. These people should be our heroes. Joseph was a man who was of tremendous acumen, mighty in wisdom. He was the prime minister of Egypt. He was a man who shouldered burdens, who served others, who was an example, who was looked up to for guidance and wisdom. But you know, his character was astonishing. In the latter days of his of the story in Genesis, you know, I wrote a couple of weeks ago about how his mercy was just unbelievable. The very mercy of Christ. You know, Jesus says in the New Testament, "Be merciful as your Father is merciful," and he says, "And then you will be called sons of the Most High," which means you'll carry the very family likeness of the family of God that you're in. Because mercy, not dealing with people as they ought to be dealt with, you think of him and his brothers, is not a human proclivity. No. That's a quality of God, whose mercy is high above, mercy is so great above the earth. And Psalm 103 says, as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his mercy to those who fear him, for he hasn't dealt with us according to our sins and iniquities. That's the verse I was thinking of. And Joseph embodied that. You know, Daniel as well, a man of wisdom. A man who was a giant in a foreign kingdom, in Babylon, in the Babylonian and Persian kingdoms. And a man with, courage. A man who stood firm against a maniacal king because he had that depth of character to draw on. And both of those guys proved their character young. Joseph proved his character young when he was 17, and a beautiful woman made moves against him. And, you know, here is a guy who's lost in the world, who's alone, whose life is basically over, who's enslaved. But what does he say? Someone's still watching. He says, "How can I do this great sin against my God?" He stands firm. Daniel the same, maybe 15. And it all started when he was asked to eat that food offered to idols. And he said, I can't. Why? Deep conviction that he would honour God first. And God saw that. And I often say, when I talk about those guys to youth groups and stuff, I say that was the first day of the rest of their lives. Because God saw it and God honoured it. But I could talk about so many people in the Bible. I could talk about all the guys in the Old Testament. And there are girls there as well who did amazing things, but this was called A Manifesto For Men, so I'm going to focus in. The one that I really want to focus on, finally, is Jesus. And you say, well, how much did we know about Jesus when he was a youth? Actually, you'd be surprised. There's not much written about it, but there's just this one verse in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, which is so full of meaning. And it describes Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30. And it says this, it says, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and men. There's a lot in that, you'd be surprised. That word grew or increased, it depends what Bible you use. The Greek word there, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'm not a Greek scholar, but what that means is to forge ahead, like a pioneer beating out a path, cutting down trees and moving forward in hostile territory. Or it can also be used in terms of a smith hammering out a length of metal. And it carries the whole idea of decided, sustained and deliberate effort. Someone who is energized, someone who is bringing his life under control, who is not given to that what I'll call besetting sin of young men, which is laziness, dissipation, wasting of time. I read a little book by J.C. Ryle called Advice for Young Men. I'd encourage you to have a look at it. And he lists there typical vices of young men, and one of them is laziness and dissipation. And here's Jesus. No, he's not doing that. And the tragedy is, we actually encourage this in men of a certain age. While they're still young, we'll have fun. Well, I have friends who've literally partied around the world from the age of 20 to the age of 30. But you know something? A great quote I once heard, which is so true. Who you are when you're 20 will determine who you are when you're 30. And who you are when you're 30 will determine who you are when you're 40. It is that serious, and I have learned that that is true. And Jesus is not going there. Jesus is forging ahead. He is pressing forward. He is, through sustained and determined effort, bringing all of those natural male proclivities under control. What for? Well, for 3 areas of growth: wisdom, stature, favour with God and men. And it's interesting when you go through that. Wisdom is kind of mental, stature is physical, and favour with God and men is spiritual. So you think, wow, there is quite a lot here. And they're really profound. You go into wisdom, for example. Someone who's growing in wisdom, and if you're a student of the Proverbs, you'll pick this up. First and foremost, what that means is that they are somebody, well, maybe not first and foremost, it might be a bit strong, because fear of God is probably first and foremost in wisdom. But right up front in wisdom is the idea that you know that you don't know. You know that you are incomplete. You know that you need from outside that growth and that development. And your posture is one of humility. Your posture is one of taking this time in your life to listen, to learn, and to grow into what you are not. And of course I said fear of God starts, so obviously it's growing in godliness actually in its core. Now that is completely different to another vice that young men have. And by the way, I know this because I'm a young man and I can tell you, the other vice young men have is an anti-authoritarian spirit, a pride, and an undue pride, one that is based on what? The fact that you're a man? No, you're nothing. You have so much to grow into it. If you had a sight of God and the character that he has in Christ, you'd never feel that way. And Proverbs is full of instructions saying, it says, do not despise, young man. Do not despise, young man, wisdom and instruction. With all you're getting, he says, get wisdom. And to find the young man who hasn't despised wisdom and instruction in his youth, there are many, but there's many that haven't. And it is perhaps all too rare. But I reckon about the most profound of these three is growing in favour with God and men. And this brings me full circle back to something I said earlier. Favour, you could translate it grace as well, I learned. But also, with God and men, it kind of loses the Greek preposition that's there, which is para, as in parallel. And para means alongside. What it really means is he's growing in grace or growing in favour alongside or in fellowship with God and alongside or in fellowship with men. I think that's very beautiful. And this is the astonishing thing. When I read that, I go, really? Because these things are so often in conflict. If you're going to grow in favour with men as a young guy, what does that usually mean? Because this is another a vice, a besetting sin, if you like, of young men, which is that they crave approval of others. They're man-pleasers. That actually, one of the things that I've really observed is this gripping fear of failure that prevents young men doing big things and lifting heavy rocks and taking responsibility because they are afraid of failure. And what does that mean? They're afraid of what others will see of them in that weakness which they can't handle. And that actually draws us down. It draws us down into this realm of pleasing others, being in favour with them, and that draws us away from favour with God. Because frankly, the kinds of things we have to do to fit in there and to be welcomed and loved there are not the kinds of things that put us in grace and favour with God, which is godly character, which is prayerfulness, which is abiding in Christ, as it says in Scripture. And so you say to yourself, well, what's going on? This is not a young man from 12 to 30 who has been dragged down by others into the muck of, worldly living. No. This is a man who is first and foremost, and notice first it says in favour with God. He is first and foremost one who is growing in his fellowship with God. And as that spiritual character builds in his life, as it forms him, and as he becomes that man in favour with God, others are drawn up. It's almost like they're drawn up into that orbit. And this is what strength of character does. Strength of character makes that man the example that he desires to be. The one to lead others in good paths. The one to, by his mere presence, and you see this so much, by his mere presence, he has a profound impact on those around him for good. There is a desirability there. There is a difference there that draws others up into that place, which is not actually fellowship with him, but it points them towards who he really is, which is one walking in fellowship with God. That is where our masculine strength finds its true fulfillment. That is the kind of man that I believe every young man, somewhere in his heart of hearts, that's the kind of man that he wants to be. And as I have studied this and prepared for this writing and this vlog, I've been deeply challenged. And I trust that others are too. And I would say that the solution here, or the first baby step, is to simply go in prayer and tell the Lord that this is who we wish to be. We wish to be the men in our generation who can be all that we are supposed to be through strength of character.